Well, I think we can get started either way. You guys are here. You were here on time, so it's only right to start. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming to this session. Um, so these enrichment activities are supposed to be extracurricular. So we're just going to be talking about a topic that I think is really interesting and it's fascinating. And apparently you think the same because you're here right now. And we'll just have a discussion to kind of better understand what is going on between Apple and Epic, and potentially look at the broader picture, kind of put it in context, and maybe talk a bit about what we can learn from this particular case. This is supposed to be fun and interactive, so I have a set of slides that I would like to get through, but if you guys have anything you want to discuss or you have any questions, please by all means do ask and speak up, because I think really this is first and foremost about us just having a bit of interactivity, I think, which will probably be the last time we'll have this for the rest of the academic year. Fingers crossed. So yeah, let's enjoy it, right? All right, so I'll talk a bit about myself. My name is Joost Rietveld. I've been here at the UCL School of Management since 2018. Before that, I was a professor at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, where I'm from. And I started my PhD at Cass Business School, or formerly Cass Business School here in London. And then halfway through, I kind of transferred to NYU in New York. That's where I finished my PhD. A lot of my research is on how platforms compete and how competition within digital platforms take place, and kind of trying to understand the dynamics that are going on. And a lot of my thinking is driven from a background in the video game industry. So I've worked in the games industry for a couple of years before I started my stint in academia. I first worked for a game developer. I put a bunch of games out on the App Store, on Nintendo platforms, on PC. And when I transferred into academia, I also did a bunch of consultancy work, mostly with the trade associations for the video game industries, both here in the UK, which I still work with, and in the US. And so a lot of my research also analyzes data from these particular platforms. So I really kind of live and breathe platforms, and particularly video game platforms. So this is a really nice case for me to be discussing with you guys. I also have two Instagram celebrity cats, Moose and Matti. They have over 80,000 followers. I've done brand partnerships with Spotify, with the Secret Life of Pets movies, with Made.com, which is a furniture brand. And so some of my thinking about this also comes from kind of actually, I guess, having two influencer cats, which is just a fun hobby. All right, so enough about me. I would also like to kind of hear a bit about you guys. I mean, we're a small group, so we can do a round of introductions. Maybe tell us a little bit about where you're from, what brings you here, what you're studying, and maybe your interest in this particular case and sessions. Would you like to go first? No? Sunny, would you like to go first?
He's one of our best searchers.
I'll give you your £5 after this.
Yes, I'm Maizini. I come from Egypt. I'm studying currently a Master's of Business Analytics. After 13 years of professional work experience, I'm back to studying, so it's like a really interesting journey I'm on. I'm in this session because I honestly don't have any professional background in the gaming industry, and I'm interested in platforms in general, so I'm looking into get some more about this.
Great. Okay. Well, I hope that this session will at least give you a flavor of that. I mean, we only have 90 minutes, but so Zini, you said?
Mai. My name is Mai.
Mai.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
My name's Ani. I'm originally from India. I just right now I'm studying marketing, and now I'm doing the master's management course. And I chose this topic because I pretty much grew up with video games my entire life, and so I love playing video games. This seeing the connection between Fortnite and Apple, I thought this would be interesting to kind of learn about. So,
What's your favorite game?
my favorite game I'd have to is Grand Theft Auto.
Grand Theft Auto.
I think
Okay,
it's just ahead of its time.
great. Okay. Well, it has its foundations here in the UK, right? So it's nice.
Hello guys. Yeah, I'm a management and finance at my university degree at University of Leicester in Asia, which the major is content marketing. This time I would like to try some management or a strategy concept of accounting.
Great. Welcome. Yeah. So I teach in the management, master's in management program. I teach business strategy, but I think I will only have you then in class because.
Finance? I think mine is second.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's me. Yeah. Yeah. You won't be in my class, but you have some really cool other classes. All right. So let's talk about Epic versus Apple. First, kind of setting the scene. Maybe you, because I think you have a bit of background. Can you very briefly share with us what you think is kind of the whole fuss about?
As in for Epic Games.
Yeah. So what is the dispute?
Honestly, I don't.
Okay.
I'm not too sure.
All right.
I briefly looked at the online store here, and what from what I understand, they started charging pieces cryptocurrency outside of the platform, and Apple supposedly gets a 30% without any money coming in, but they didn't, so they removed the game from the platform.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's in a nutshell pretty much what is going on. So Epic is the developer of this hugely popular video game, Fortnite, and Fortnite is available on a lot of different platforms, right? So there's kind of this distinction between games that are platform exclusive and those that are platform agnostic. And Fortnite is kind of an exemplar of a platform agnostic game, so you can download it on your iPhone, on your Android phone. It's available on consoles and on PC. And so the business model for Fortnite is it's a free game. You can download it for free, but then you can spend money inside the game via so-called in-app purchases or microtransactions. And the way that happens is, as a consumer, you buy. Hi, come on in. No worries. As a consumer, you buy V-Bucks, and V-Bucks are the currency that kind of sustains the economy inside of the game. And if you buy V-Bucks, a part of that money goes to Epic directly, and part of it goes to the platform on which the game is hosted. And typically the platform gets 30% on all the revenues that are being generated either from consumers buying an app or a game, or from the money they spend inside an app of a game or a game. Right? And Epic thought, well, why should we share this 30% with Apple? They're only maintaining a platform for us. Let's offer an option for consumers to go outside of the platform and buy these V-Bucks directly from us. And on top of that, we'll make them 20% cheaper, right? Because we no longer have to share 30% with Apple. So we'll drop the price, and that way pretty much everyone will go through us directly rather than using the kind of Apple facilitated option. And that's against the rules. Whenever a developer obtains a license from one of these platforms, they sign a licensing agreement, and part of the licensing agreement states that every transaction that happens inside of your app or for actually obtaining your app, we get 30% of that. So Epic knowingly violates Apple's terms. Apple pulls Fortnite from the App Store because of this violation of the terms, and Google follows suit. So it's being pulled from Android, it's being pulled from iOS. And the interesting thing is, Epic immediately sues. So this is a very carefully orchestrated attack, if you will. This is not something that comes as a surprise. They were kind of counting on this to happen. And so immediately after Apple and Google pull the game, Epic files a lawsuit against Apple and Google, 2 separate lawsuits, and they launched this really interesting free Fortnite campaign, which is a consumer goal-oriented, consumer-targeted campaign, which pretty much says as much as Fortnite is being held hostage, and we have to play by the rules of these platforms. And now that we didn't, we no longer are able to offer our product on these platforms that you all use and love. And then Apple and Google kind of have no option but to countersue. So that's the dispute in a nutshell. And so the one thing that is really interesting about this, I mean, there's lots of things that we will talk about that is interesting, but it's so carefully orchestrated on Epic's side. Right? They immediately sue, and they immediately launch this free Fortnite campaign that is paired with this really interesting short film that I'll show you. And the short film is actually, so this campaign is called 1980 Fortnite. We'll talk a bit about why. This short video is a parody on one of Apple's most famous and legendary advertisements. So I will show you both very quickly. Yeah, absolutely.
So currently, if you want to play the game, Google and Apple, is there other platforms?
Yes. So it's a platform-agnostic game, and you can play it on video game consoles like a Nintendo or an Xbox. You can play it on PC.
So I want to translate my phone.
Yes. And so the dispute is directly with Apple and Google because they've pulled these games from their app stores.
Is there a recent ruling on this case?
Yeah.
It's supposed to reinstate Fortnite on the top.
Oh, that is then very recent. I checked. Okay, yeah, we'll talk a bit about that. So this won't be about kind of the legalistic side of things, but much rather kind of the strategy and the tactics that are going on. But some of the language that is included in these lawsuits is very informative. So I will draw a bit on some of that language. But let's first have a look at these videos. The original commercial from Apple.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification directives. We have created, for the first time in all history, a garden of pure ideology, where each worker may bloom, secure from the pests of any contradictory force. Our unification, of course, is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people, with one will, one resolve, one cause. Our enemies shall talk themselves to death, and we will bury them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
On January 24th, Apple Computer will introduce Macintosh. And you'll see why 1984 won't be like 1984.
All right, so very similar presentations. One was launched in December of 1983. The other was launched a couple of months ago. So what's 1984? What is Apple's original commercial alluding to? Right, so it's a reference to a George Orwell book, which is called 1984. And that book is about how in 1984, the book was written in the late 40s, how 1984 probably Britain will be controlled by a big brother who's kind of watching every step we make. Maybe we're pretty close up. That's another discussion. Watching every step we take, they're controlling our lives and whatnot. And that book is a cultural phenomenon, right? So sometimes we talk about an Orwellian state. And so it's really ingrained in kind of our culture and our thinking. What was the Apple video about? Yeah, right. So Apple was alluding to IBM's near monopoly on the computer market, and how IBM is kind of this Orwellian entity, if you will. And they say, well, in a few weeks we're going to launch our Mac, and it's going to be this underdog, and it's going to fight this Orwellian big brother that is IBM, and we will smash the monopoly. And so Epic has done something very clever. It's taken that exact same messaging, and it's turned it against Apple. Apparently, what they're saying now is Apple has become Big Brother. Apple has become the IBM of our current day and age. And we need to break the Apple monopoly to prevent that today won't be like 1984. So here is 1980 Fortnite. Right, it's very, very clever. Again, very pre-rationed. In addition to this video, they also launched a couple of in-game tournaments under the hashtag #FreeFortnite, where prizes could be won, but clearly not by those who are playing on an iOS or a Google Play device, because they could not really access the game. And so that also sends a clear message, and is very targeted towards consumers, that consumers need to pay attention because something is happening here, and us as Epic, the underdog, we're going to fight this Apple monopoly that's currently in place. So why did Apple pull Fortnite, right? So we briefly discussed about this is what was going on. Traditionally, you would have only the Google Play Store pay option or only the Apple App Store pay option. But now here there's the Epic Direct Payment. It circumvents the platform. And by the way, it's 20% cheaper. Why? It's kind of obvious, but still, let's discuss it. Why do Apple and Google have such problems with this type of behavior? Right. This is a rule. Developers signed a licensing agreement that says this type of behavior is unacceptable. And if we let Epic get away with it, it might set a precedent for other app developers. Right, again, so this is a large part, and we will talk about exactly how large of a part, but this is a large part of Apple's and Google's income. It's the revenue share that they're getting from third-party applications. And besides not wanting to open the floodgates, they just don't want to miss the revenue that Fortnite is generating for Apple and Google. And so, if you look at the language in either PR or the lawsuit, what Apple is saying, well, Epic Games, they took the unfortunate step of violating App Store guidelines that are applied to all developers equally and are designed to keep the store safe for our users. As a result, the app has been removed. And Apple is saying, well, and Epic did this with the express intent of violating App Store guidelines regarding in-app purchases. And they're also referring to the fact that Epic has tried to negotiate with Apple before doing this. So negotiations were going on. Apparently, Apple decided it didn't want to cave, and Epic decided it didn't want to cave either, and so they did this. Right? And so Apple is saying the fact that their business interests now lead them to push them for a special arrangement does not change the fact that these guidelines create a level playing field for all developers and make the store safe for all users. We have rules that apply uniformly, and no company, not even the developer of the most popular video game, can get away with that. What has Epic's response been? What has Epic's messaging been? How do they perceive and position their situation?
Forced monopoly, because like someone who is controlling the team that they get. The Epic Games is all about getting out of this monopoly. Is that what's your question?
Yeah, that's the type of answer that I'm looking for. Okay, so Apple has created a monopoly with the App Store. Yeah, so what they're saying is, it's not so much about us seeking special treatment. It's really about this whole ecosystem that you guys are maintaining is fundamentally flawed. So we don't seek special exception for Epic. We firmly believe that both Apple and Google's policies must be changed for all developers. So Epic is kind of positioning it as we're kind of on a crusade here. We want to change things for the better for everyone. This is not just about us. Over a decade, Apple and Google have single-mindedly crafted and proliferated a tangled web of rules and policies to impose a 30% tax on apps. And this is a really interesting phrase, right? So from Apple's perspective, it's a revenue share that they're getting because they're facilitating this technological platform. But Apple says it's a tax. We're plainly paying a 30% tax. And Apple and Google are preventing competitors from offering a better deal. When competition is stifled, the customer always loses. Their rules are designed to cement their monopolies, to limit consumer choice, and to stifle competition in digital goods. So they're really trying to breaking it up to a much broader thing, where apparently Apple and Google have this monopoly. So what do they mean by monopoly? What is the Apple monopoly that Apple allegedly maintains? What is this monopoly?
Yes, I guess the monopoly is that there is no other app store for an app. That's what must be Apple App Store.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So if you own an iOS device, and this is often referred to as a walled garden, it's a walled garden, right? You can only run operating system and app stores that are maintained and owned and operated by Apple. So it's a bit of a, within the ecosystem that is an Apple smartphone or an Apple tablet, there is a monopoly. We could also see this from a slightly different perspective. It's definitely the right answer you're giving, but there's kind of a secondary answer to it. From a different perspective, there's also another type of monopoly that arguably exists. If we look at it at the industry level, Apple and Google maintain what, 85, 90% of the market, right? And so together, neither one of them may have a monopoly, but together they have a duopoly, right? And if there's any form of even implicit collusion going on between Apple and Google, we know this from our microecon kind of course, right? That duopoly behaves the same way as a monopoly, unless there's fierce competition between them. So Epic is making this broader argument. They are seeking a change in the rules, not just for themselves, but for everyone. They're trying to break open this monopoly that Apple and Google are allegedly having. Right, and is there any type of precedent to this? Does it make sense to make such an argument? Those are two separate questions. You can answer either one of them. Is it a logical argument? Yeah?
Either point, but I don't know if I agree with it.
Right. Well, we'll talk about that. Yeah? Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's a very carefully orchestrated attack, and it's not just to resolve a dispute between two businesses. They're really trying to make a much bigger point. And I'll talk also a bit about kind of the timing of this particular attack in kind of a broader in the broader scheme of things, because also the timing is not a coincidence.
Can I ask game for free completely?
You can download it for free, so it's a so-called free-to-play game. It installs on your phone. You can play it, but if you want to access certain features or if you want to access certain events in the game, then you have to buy these V-Bucks as a consumer that you then spend within the game. And so the developers, it's kind of the game, if you will, is almost like an economy or a market, right? You can enter the market for free, but if you want to engage in any type of special services or access, then you have to spend money, which are these V-Bucks, these virtual currencies.
Do they collaborate with other games? Like some sort? Can I buy? I don't know how the game
Right. Well, so there's different types of in-app purchases depending on the type of game, and even the type of platform, right? So I'll just generalize this a little bit to kind of talk about this, right? So one thing could be there's advertisements in the game, and you pay a bit of money to get rid of the advertisements. Another could be you can play the first three levels for free, and then if you want additional levels, you pay for those. Yet another could be the single player campaign is free, but if you want to play with your friends, you have to unlock that and you have to pay for it. Yet another could be, I want to dress up my character in the game, and I want this really cool outfit, or I want this really cool item. Then you can pay those, you can buy those items. So there's all sorts of different things that you can do. And Epic has, this game is so big, and so it's almost become a platform by itself. And so now sometimes artists, real life artists, perform inside the game. So I've never.
Take money from the artist. I'm trying to understand if they practice what they're preaching, or it's just a stunt. This is what it is. I'm trying to get to know more about.
Well, I mean, these in-game transactions is what the developer is generating revenue from. So it's everything for them. They may have some partnerships. For example,
Do they take money from the artist, for example?
So I think they would actually pay the artist
Okay.
to perform inside the game, but they potentially could have a partnership with McDonald's in the game, right? Like this has not happened in this particular game, but it's happened in other games, and then McDonald's pays them to proliferate their food inside the game.
I think ethics are very desire. It's a very different side from Apple, because Apple have this huge marketplace, and I think it's just one of the, and that's where it's coming from. I think if it made this all about itself, it's very hard to get attention because there are lots of people like you and me who don't play their games. But if you made this about all apps that you use, and saying that you could actually see a decrease in the number of new apps that come on board because developers cannot afford this app, then more people will learn about it. And in the court of public opinion, they could actually win. And that could actually make Apple make change instead of having court polls and agree.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and we'll talk a bit about those dynamics in a bit. So I wanted to, when I asked, is there any type of precedent to this, and maybe I'm disclosing my age here, but in the early 2000s there was an antitrust case against Microsoft, because Microsoft bundled with Windows, for example, the Internet Explorer and other types of software. which made it really hard for external developers to offer that type of software, because if it comes pre-bundled, it's the default choice. As a consumer, you're very likely to stick with that unless you're really kind of geeky and you want to read into the differences between different browsers. And the same thing could be said for Office software and whatnot, right? And so in the early 2000s, it was ruled that Microsoft indeed acted monopolistically, and they had to change some of their practices, such as unbundle the browser software from their operating system, so that it would not give consumers a default choice. And so that's going to be a very important case that the judge will fall back on in evaluating this particular case, because that's pretty much the only case that's like it. All right, so I want to have a closer look at the company Epic Games, and it's really important to kind of understand the type of company that Epic is in understanding where they're coming from and why they are doing this. First and foremost, I want to say that this is an established company. It's been around since the early 90s, and that by itself is more exception than rule in this particular industry, right? As a video game developer, I notice you're pretty much always facing financial difficulties. Games typically fail. Only a very small percentage of the market becomes hits, and the rest tends to really struggle to break even. But Epic Games has managed to be successful since the early 90s and throughout, and they have been really able to understand the trends in the markets and even shape them with the types of games that they have released. So they started out with Unreal and Gears of War, which are much more traditional type of games that you would buy and you would play them by yourself. And then they've migrated into this business model with Fortnite, where games can be played for free. They have a much longer life cycle. You spend money inside of the game. And very early on, the CEO, Tim Sweeney, already had this vision of games as a service. He talks about the metaverse, which is kind of like everything that's happening in real life should also be able to happen inside of this game. So we should have concerts. We should be able to hang out together. We should be able to do different types of things solely within kind of the confinements of a game. And they pretty much did that with Fortnite, right? It's not just a video game developer either, and this is going to be very important. They also have a game engine. What's an engine? An engine is the software you use to make software. So it's kind of your toolbox as a developer. And this engine is, it has like 23% of the global market for engines. And it's not just being used for video games, it's also being used by auto manufacturers, it's being used by animation studios and whatnot. So it's a really well-established engine. And already here we're starting to see that if Epic is able to make some changes, those changes might spill over to some of its other products, right? Because a lot of developers on the App Store are using the Unreal Engine. And we'll talk a bit about Unreal's business model in a minute. And then third, and very importantly, Epic has its own store. Epic has its own app store, the Epic Game Store, which was launched only back in 2018. It's currently only available for PC platforms, but surely they would be interested in having that platform available on smartphones, right? So kind of what you're saying is like they want to kind of establish a broader mandate with regards to other developers, but they also have an interest kind of up and down the value chain as well. And that's going to be, I think that is one of the main reasons that motivates them to be so aggressive in this particular dispute. Because let's face it, they're losing money every day Fortnite is not available on these platforms. It's also a company that is able to engage in this specific battle because it's still privately owned, but they do have backing from a really large and established company in the form of Tencent. Tencent is one of China's biggest tech players, and they acquired a 48% stake in Epic in 2012 for $330 million. That was a pretty darn good investment, considering the type of money that Fortnite and Unreal make.
How much do you charge sellers?
It's a good point. We'll get to it. Yeah. So Epic has used Fortnite before as a vehicle to kind of push for changes in the industry. This is not the first time. Right? Fortnite is one of the biggest games in the market. It has 350 million registered accounts, which is huge. Right? If you think about how many PlayStation 4s have been sold, that's maybe 80 or 70 million consoles, right? So this game alone has a broader player base than many platforms have that serve as an entire market. It earned $2.4 billion in 2018 alone, so it's massive. And previously, it's already tried to bypass the Google Play Store, right? If you have an Android phone, you can run software outside of the Google Play Store. It's really tricky. It's really complicated to do that as a lay person. It's called side loading, but they've done it with Fortnite initially to kind of send a statement already to Google saying, hey, we'd much rather do it without your help and outside of your platform than within. Clearly, not many people actually downloaded the game that way, and so they caved and they made the game available on the Google Play Store. But it was an early sign of trying to create changes with this particular game. And then another thing that they've done is, which is also kind of unique, they have advocated for interoperability across platforms. So typically, if you have a game on a PlayStation, you can only play with other players that also own the game on PlayStation. And what they have done is Epic said, well, we would like, if you have Fortnite, to be able to play with your friends across iOS, across PlayStation, across Switch, and so forth. And they've managed to do that. And that was the first time, especially that the video game consoles made such a change. Right? So they've really used this game, this software, to also kind of push for changes in the industry at large. So the Unreal Engine also is interesting, right? So if you, as a software developer, want to use the Unreal Engine, step back. If you want to use any engine, typically you would get a licensing agreement. So you would pay $5,000 a year, and then you can use this engine to make your games. And Epic said, well, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is, you can use it for free, but we'll take 5% of your revenues, which is clever, because if a game is a success, you'll earn much more than your licensing agreement. But it also takes out the risk for the developers. They can use this engine for free. There's no costs to it. So pretty developer-friendly business model. And they've gone one step further. They've gone two steps further. First, they've said, if you release your game on our platform, we'll not charge you any revenue share. So already they're kind of pushing their own platform here. And they also said, well, if you make less than 1 million, which, let's face it, the vast majority of games do, we will also not share in your revenue at all. So very developer-friendly. So they are, in that regard, practicing what they're preaching in the sense that they're trying to be friendly to developers. So here's the revenue share for the Epic Game Store. It's 12%. And so it's not 30%. And again, they're saying, we don't need to charge 30% to break even. We can charge 12%. And so again, they're more or less practicing what they're preaching. Although, if you look at the texts of their lawsuits, they're actually comparing these platforms to credit cards, which take less than 1%. And you're saying platforms should take less than 1%. But they're still taking 12% themselves. They've been very aggressively in trying to attract game developers to their platform, for example, by guaranteeing them minimum revenues. So regardless of how well your game sells, please come to the Epic Game Store. We'll give you this bag of money either way. which clearly they need to establish their platform as well, right? I mean, they're a new platform market, and they need to differentiate themselves from these giants. And so they've not been shy about that. They also want to be on these smartphone devices. And I think this is kind of the crux of the whole dispute. They want to break open these walled gardens for other platforms. And I think the expectation on Epic's side is we can do games better than a generalist. And so if we are able to enter that platform, probably we will do very well. Maybe. Are there any questions or comments so far? It helps you see things from a different, or from a broader context, really, right? This is not just about this game.
Do you have any insight about Apple's strategy?
Yeah, they are pretty serious about it because games are one of the biggest revenue drivers in on the iOS App Store. And so they've launched Apple Arcade, and I'm not too familiar with it, but I think it's a subscription service where you can access some games free of charge as long as you pay the subscription fee. Well, the App Store by itself is direct competition already, right? So again, games are, I think, the biggest category, at least in terms of revenue, on the iOS App Store. Yeah.
Do they have that to the direct profile, or is it just not allowed?
So that's not allowed, right? And this is not so. And so they're trying to do this site loading for the Epic Game Store as well. So you can release software outside of the Google Play Store, but it's really difficult for consumers to access that software. But they're planning on doing it anyway to kind of kick in the door, I guess. And probably it won't be very successful, but at least that gives them a foot in the door. And maybe that will be a first step towards, I think what they're envisioning is when you have an Android phone, you load it up, it asks you which store do you want to access, right? That's kind of, I think that's what their ideal situation will be. All right, so let's flip the perspective and talk a bit about why is Apple justified to take a 30% fee? It's their good right. Why? Why is it fine for Apple to do this?
I mean, for a lot of games that aren't popular, being on the app includes their brand. So the way Apple helps their brand image by allowing them to be in the app store.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, they're one of the biggest companies.
There's billions of consumers that own an iOS device. And if you want to tap into that market, you have to pay. Yeah. Other reasons? There's a bunch of them. Yeah.
They invest a lot on that app store or platform is pure, the reviews they do for the app, like sort of complements if it's on the app store, I can trust it.
Yeah. They maintain this operating system and they maintain this store and they carefully review everything that's being submitted to it to protect consumers. They make sure that the newest features that consumers want are part of the iOS operating system and are available to app developers to bring inside of their products. And it costs money to do that.
They invest a lot in investment and guidelines. There's a lot of effort in the background.
Definitely. It's not a credit card company. It's a technological innovation that they're sustaining. Other reasons? There's one important one, and I don't expect you to come up with it immediately, but if anyone has another reason why this is perfectly fine for Apple to do. Yeah? Oh, if there's kind of a capacity, if you will?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's more or less limited. Sorry, unlimited. Yeah, it's digital, right? It's not like you're going to Tesco's and there's shelves, but but clearly Apple very carefully, right? If you enter your App Store, there's a selection of apps that Apple presents to you. So they do very much curate their store. And there's also effort and investments that are going into this practice to make sure the store looks pretty, that if you like apps about cats, you get to see those, and if I like apps about dresses, I get to see those, kind of thing, right? So there is a store management aspect to it as well. I mean, one of the key things, in my view, that a lot of the coverage is overlooking is Apple is operating a platform business model, right? Apple has two types of customers, consumers and app developers. And they have designed their business model in such a way that it is as cheap as possible for consumers to obtain an iOS device. They're still very expensive. But in many ways, consumers are subsidized to bring them in, to create a market that is attractive for app developers, and app developers are then monetized. So it's a carefully designed business model that takes into account two sides of the market. And so by purely looking at that 30% fee, we're overlooking the fact that probably if there wasn't a 30% fee, iOS devices would be much more expensive for consumers. The market would be much smaller for app developers to tap into. And it would not just be as an attractive ecosystem as it is now, right? So it oversees the fact that this is a multi-sided business model. If we think about this in the context of video game consoles, for video game consoles, it's to the extent that if you buy a Xbox or a PlayStation, you generate a loss for Sony and Microsoft. Why? Because they need to create that market for game developers to sell to. And so developers are overcharged. I don't think that's the case for Apple. I'm pretty sure Apple still makes a profit on their devices. But they are taking into account the two customers that they have, and they have to balance what they're charging on each side. Right, and even clearer example of this type of business model is newspapers. We read newspapers for free. It's not free to produce news, but if there's lots of us reading the news, it's interesting for advertisers, right? So there's again, an example of a multi-sided business model where we should not just look at the pricing on one side, but we should look at the pricing across both sides. Right, so these were my reasons. It's their app store, they can do what they want. Developers sign a licensing agreement, they have to adhere to it, right? There's costs to maintaining the app store and upgrading the iOS. Another important part that we'll talk a bit about is income from hardware, from smartphones, is in decline because the market is getting saturated. So Apple needs to shift the weight of their business model to the software side. Income from the App Store subsidizes revenue on phone and iPad sales. But this is a really important point that I think will come back to haunt them in the lawsuit, in the court case. They have made some exceptions for app developers on this 30% rule. And that's going to be a really contentious point. So Apple's made two exceptions on the 30% charge. One is if you're offering goods or services that take place outside of the App Store, there's no 30% charge. So if you ask for a ride for Uber, Uber does not pay 30% to Apple because they're saying it's a separate product that occurs outside of the App Store. The other exception that's a bit more problematic is they've made some exceptions for firms like Amazon. Amazon Prime, if you will. They're not paying 30%. Why? Because they're Amazon, right? And this is going to be problematic because if you're going to make exceptions for one or two companies, then you're setting a precedent, as you mentioned. And I think this is going to be a very important part of the argumentation on Epic's end. Why should some companies be exempted from this tax and not others? We should all be exempted from it. Because tax has a negative connotation. It's not a tax, but, they're carefully choosing their words here. And importantly, if my next slide will load, 30% is the industry norm. If you look at PC stores such as Steam, such as Microsoft, Good Old Games, 30%. If you look at consoles, PlayStation, Xbox, Nintendo, 30%. If you look at mobile stores, we now know 30%. So Apple is just complying to the industry norm. No, because physical stores before it did it. And even more so, just kind of all the way before digital, they took 40% because it's a lot more expensive to maintain an actual physical store. And so the argument has always been, well, digital is a lot more attractive to everyone because the stores only take 30%. But now that everything is digital, we no longer have that outside option kind of where there's a physical option to point to, right? And so now Epic is arguing, well, 30% actually is too much. Well, it is the norm for software sales across different market segments. So, and clearly, Apple and Google are prime targets, right? Because if they change, probably some of these other actors will follow. Maybe not so much some of the smaller players. Yeah.
Is it a sign that there is some oligopoly behavior happening? Everyone just follows competes using the tracks.
Yeah, that's a good point. Maybe. Yeah, we don't know, right? So collusion is always really hard to detect. But they clearly all seem to think that 30% is a nice number. Yeah. All right. So how much money are we talking about? How much money do you think Apple is generating from software revenue share a year? Any guess is fine.
20 billion.
Okay, 20 billion is a lot of money.
Are we talking general or specifically from the app?
Yeah, how much money is Apple making from revenue share in the App Store per year? 5 billion? 2 billion? 1.5? 4 billion? Sticking with 20?
No, I'm not. But I don't know. I don't know.
It's just guessing games. What do you think? 2 billion? At least. Okay, you're drastically adjusting your. So I'll be at the top and at the bottom of the estimate. Sunny, do you want to guess? 2 billion. Yeah, we're just pulling numbers out of thin air. That's all right. It's fun to play guessing games, right? So I have to preface this by saying Apple is not disclosing this, right? So they are very secretive about this. But there have been various reports that range from 15 to 18.3 billion a year just from revenue share from third-party apps.
That wasn't so far.
It wasn't so far off. Google will be less because the problem with the Google Play Store is that it tends to attract consumers that are not as likely to spend money on software than Apple. Apple tends to attract more affluent consumers. But I'm sure it's a lot. They actually, I think they are now. I don't know the details of this, so it's a bad story for mine. But they're launching the Google Play Store, I think, officially in India around this time as the de facto app store, and they're really hammering down on the 30%. So that was kind of interesting type of news that arose over the last 2 weeks. That even though they're facing all this scrutiny, they've actually made a point of saying, well, we're launching in India and it's going to be 30%. And you deal with it. So to put that in context, this number, so this revenue share is part of what is called Apple Services segment. So this is everything that is Apple software related business. So Apple Music, Apple Arcade, pretty much every income that they generate from software related activities. And we can see that share is very much on the rise in relation to Apple's total income. So it's about 20% of Apple's total income, and it's increasing. And Apple's services segment generates roughly 40 billion, and so third-party revenue share is approximately half, 40% to half of what they're generating on their services side. So it's a really substantial, significant amount of money, even kind of considering Apple's other activities. So they will not be eager to reduce that 30%. Are there any questions or comments so far? I'm going to shift gears a little bit after this slide. Okay.
Is there an estimate for how much it actually costs to maintain such a marketplace?
Well, so this is the point, right? They've achieved such scale on the software side that one could very reasonably argue that 30% at this point in time is too much, because they're getting 30% from millions of apps on the App Store. Maybe early on, when there were only tens of thousands of apps and the App Store still needed a lot of updating and investment, maybe 30% was pretty good. Maybe it was even too low at that point in time. So there is an evolutionary aspect to this story that is not often talked about, right? So in my and I've done some research on how platforms evolve over time, but not so much the business model. But in my view, they should consider updating this revenue share as a function of the number of consumers, the number of apps, and kind of their market share in the overall market. But doing that, there's definitely no precedent to that, and so it requires a lot of kind of tinkering and strategic thought to do that. But that would make it arguably fairer. No, it would not be. Platforms do this in the sense that, so we talked about Epic Game Store taking 12%, right? Epic Game Store launched 2 years ago. They need developers desperately. And so they may change to 30% once their market position is more established. We don't know, right? There definitely is a dynamic component to pricing in platforms based on how desperately you need developers and based on how bullish you can be once you have a dominant market position. All right, so I want to talk about kind of putting this whole dispute in a broader context, particularly from Apple's perspective. Right, and as I mentioned before, the timing of Apple's attack is no coincidence. It's no coincidence. There is a lot going on currently that exposes Apple to threats and risks, and I'll talk about each of these in more detail. But so there's a lot of allegations about Apple potentially looking at apps and saying, "Oh, that's interesting. We're going to integrate that into the iOS App Store, and into the iOS operating system." So they're kind of stealing innovations from the App Store. Spotify just last year started a similar type of campaign against Apple, also consumer-facing, where they're saying Apple is not playing fair when it comes to Apple Music versus Spotify, and something needs to be done. Talk a bit about that. Recently, and this is in part driven by Epic, there has been the formation of a coalition for app fairness. And so one of the things that Apple enjoys over app developers is bargaining power, right? Because they're the big bully, and app developers are fragmented and scattered and small. But if they self-organize, then maybe they increase some of their bargaining power. There are looming big big tech antitrust investigations that put Apple front and center that they have to deal with. And this is a bit of a shameless plug, but there's also a lot of academic research that is starting to show that once these platforms become dominant, they change how they manage their developers, and not always to the better. So I'll talk a bit about each of those. So there is this phenomenon called getting Sherlocked. And it's about how Apple uses the App Store to copy the best ideas. And this is a public secret. Like, they're not even ashamed about that they're doing this. And it comes down to Apple, basically on a daily basis, they scour the software that is available on the iOS App Store. And if they think, that's kind of cool, they draw some inspiration from that and they integrate that into the iOS operating system. It's problematic, right? Because there used to be more than 1,000 Flashlight app developers who made their living from selling Flashlight apps. Now, if you swipe up in your operating system, you have Flashlight functionality. That puts 1,000 Flashlight app developers out of business. That idea came from 1,000 Flashlight app developers, right? So you see the problem here. The first time they did this was when they integrated in they integrated a desktop search tool, which they named Sherlock. And for some reason, there was a very similar third-party software application out there that was called Watson. And so that kind of triggered the phrase, I got Sherlocked. And Steve Jobs once said, we have always been shameless about stealing great ideas. So again, they're not even ashamed about it. It happens a lot. When I worked for a game developer, this is related, it's not exactly the same, but we really wanted to get our game featured on the front page of the iOS store because that really boosts our downloads and sales. And what we learned is if there's an update to iOS that, for example, introduces in-app purchases for the first time, if we had in-app purchases in our games, we were much more likely to get features on the front page, right? So that whole kind of thinking about either sourcing innovations or promoting certain types of apps on the front page, it's all driven from Apple's perspective of making the operating system, making the platform as a whole more attractive. Which is great for Apple and in most cases for consumers, but not so good for app developers. All right, so Spotify, March last year, launched this campaign, Time to Play Fair, about leveling the playing field, and it's essentially about how Apple is giving preferential treatment to Apple Music and not to Spotify. And this argument can be extended, for example, also to Apple Movies and Netflix, for example. And I'll play a short video that nicely summarizes Spotify's concern.
We love all things audio, and we know you do too. That's why we love that Spotify is available on a number of devices, giving our fans lots of ways to listen. We also know that millions of people love Apple's platform. In fact, so do we. However, we don't love it when Apple comes between you and the things you love to listen to.
Apple tax.
If you were to upgrade to Premium in our app through the App Store, we'd have to give Apple a whopping 30% of your subscription fee. Apple knows we can't afford to pay that tax and keep our prices low for our fans. So we decided not to use their payment system. But Apple won't let you pay by any other way. Because Apple is both owner of the App Store and Spotify's competitor, they set themselves up to be referee and player in the world of audio streaming. They've been using this power to give themselves an unfair advantage that harms fans like you and companies like us. Apple regularly moves the goalposts and changes the rules of what we can and cannot do. For example, they censor us from sharing discounts or promotions with you. like our awesome deal to give you 3 months of premium for 99 cents. And they make it harder and harder for us to fix any problems or bring you the cool stuff we think you'd really enjoy. After years of unavailability, Apple has finally let us connect with Stereo to play your jams, but not as your default music player. Of course, Apple doesn't put these barriers in front of their own music service. Choice is always a better option. Apple shouldn't use their power to create an uneven playing field that only benefits themselves. It's time for Apple to play fair.
It's a good video, right? It really nicely summarizes some of the problems that Spotify.
Doing something like this is quite risky as well. Like the whole point of the talk about how they're mistreated by Apple, then Apple also get pretty annoyed by this and then move to even treat them even worse because of this like spike.
So Spotify's objective with this particular campaign was not so much creating consumer awareness, right? So this has not been as widely promoted as the Epic case. It was not so much engaging in a lawsuit with Apple, but it was about raising awareness with antitrust bodies the world over. And so this was paired with a complaint directed at the European Commission to look into Apple's unfair practices. And actually that has led to an antitrust investigation. So in that sense, this campaign has been very successful. And I would argue that this campaign, the grounds for Spotify's concern are much stronger than Epic's concerns are, right? Because Spotify is actually really treated unfairly by Apple here. Because Apple has a competing service, Apple Music, which they're not having to give up 30% because it's their product. They know exactly what is going on with the iOS operating system. They know exactly how it will be updated, so they can tweak and adjust Apple Music in a way that Spotify can't. And apparently they preferenced Apple Music in terms of you couldn't control Spotify on your smartwatch, but you could control music on Apple Music with your smartwatch. You couldn't control music for Spotify with smart speakers, but you could with Apple Music. And so that really creates an unfair advantage, right? And so I think their case is a lot stronger and I would say even more interesting. But, you know, people tend to like Fortnite better, and so that's created a bigger buzz. Right, so to summarize Spotify's allegations include that, well, Apple charges a 30% tax that it doesn't charge on its own product. As long as Spotify doesn't use Apple's payment systems, it cannot make promotions in the app. And so it's harder to upgrade a freemium user to a paying user because Spotify is not allowed to make any advertisements as long as they're not using the Apple payment system. Right, so I perhaps should have mentioned that if you want to pay for Spotify, you go to Spotify's website and you sign up. So that's how they have circumvented the Apple tax, if you will. But that has complicated kind of the consumer journey from a free to a paying product. So Apple cannot offer direct payments. Apple imposes restrictions on updates that don't apply to Apple Music. And Apple has blocked compatibility with other devices such as the watch and smart speakers. And this indeed has led to antitrust investigations into Apple, which I'll talk a bit about in a few slides from now. So the Coalition for App Fairness, it's a fancy name. It's 13 high-profile developers that have teamed up. They've created a coalition, and it's really all to kind of bash and go against Apple. So every day Apple taxes consumers and crushes innovation. And so the coalition really strives. I would say the coalition strives to commoditize platforms, because if it becomes a commodity, then you cannot price a premium, and you have a much stronger bargaining position, right? And so they've come up with these 10 principles for what an app store should look like. You don't need to read them all in detail, but essentially, if Apple, Google, Sony PlayStation would do all of this, they can no longer operate their business model. But clearly, it creates a really, really neat situation for app developers, and so that's what they're doing. And so I think, in part, this is they're based out of Washington, D.C., so I think their objective is to lobby on behalf of software developers and to create kind of awareness of some of the practices that might be questionable. And so very interestingly, just yesterday, Microsoft issued a statement saying, we're going to abide by these 10 principles for our Microsoft App Store, but we're not doing that with Xbox, which is really just the pot calling the kettle black, right? It's the exact same business model, but they've lost out on the Microsoft App Store anyway, and so that's kind of a losing game. So it might as well concede, but not with the Xbox, because that's a different product. Well, really, it's not. Yeah, so I guess I'm sure this coalition was at least partly happy about that. So big tech faces antitrust investigations. Just a couple of weeks ago, there were House judicial hearings with these big tech CEOs, and it became really clear that there is an increasing awareness, one, that maybe the existing antitrust laws that exist do not apply so well to digital goods, and so maybe we need to revise some of those laws. And two, they're becoming aware that these platforms are increasingly marketplaces themselves, and that lots of companies depend on these marketplaces, right? Whether you're a seller on Amazon, whether you're a software developer on Apple, and that in many ways, these guys here, they're kind of acting like a Putin, if you will, with regards to their own markets, right? So they are market regulators, they're market orchestrators, and they're not being, in that sense, held accountable. And again, you could argue that it's perfectly fine because it's their products, it's their services, they worked hard to get to this point. But it becomes increasingly difficult for firms that are using these platforms to be successful because of rule changes, because these guys are selling their own products on these platforms, and you name it. And a couple of days ago, actually, that same committee that had the hearing with these guys a couple of weeks ago has decided that, yes, they're acting monopolistically with regards to their own platform ecosystems. And it's a 400-page report, so I would not suggest you read that on a Sunday afternoon. But kind of the takeaway is there's probably going to be kind of lawsuits and further investigations into these guys at a very high level. Yeah, so some of the language from that report was, although these firms have delivered clear benefits to society, the dominance of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google has come at a price. These firms typically run the marketplace while also competing in it, a position that enables them to write one set of rules for others, while they play by another to engage in a form of their own private quasi-regulation, right? Private quasi-regulation that is unaccountable to anyone but themselves. And there's been a ruling in India again, for some reason, that says that Amazon can no longer sell products on Amazon to create for a fairer marketplace. And I think also Walmart can no longer sell its own products on its web store in India to make for a fairer competitive situation. Right, so as I mentioned, there is increasingly research that shows that if these platforms do make changes, it largely affects developers and not always positively. And that research also shows that as platforms become more dominant, they also become more bullish vis-a-vis the developers that are using these platforms to sell their goods. And so that's also helping to create awareness. And finally, what Epic is doing very well, there is growing support for App Store reform by consumers because they're having this fancy free Fortnite campaign, right? So us as consumers are becoming increasingly aware of the potentially questionable practices that these app stores have in place. So my question then is, should Apple concede? Should they concede? Should they change their practices? Sunny says yes. Yeah?
Yes. In such regard, unfair competition, but definitely not give level.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's such an integral part of their business model. You're not going to say, okay, let's forget about that 30%. So it's a free party for everyone. Yeah, so right, so we talked about this. The app ecosystem has reached such a large scale that they can potentially do with a lower revenue share, and maybe they need to be more dynamic in their business. We've discussed that Apple benefits from the app ecosystem in auxiliary ways. They use it for competitive intelligence, so they look at what Spotify may be doing, and they can easily copy that and do it better because they better understand their operating system, and then use that to compete with Spotify. And so, yes, definitely an unfair advantage. They're using the App Store for sourcing innovations already. We've talked about Flashlight. And doing all this and not changing your business model, it might hurt the app ecosystem in the long run, right? It might create a situation where developers no longer want to be part of this ecosystem, especially if there's some other competing app stores that are growing in popularity. They're facing legislatory pressures, and so maybe they want to throw these commissions a bone and make some changes to position themselves in a favorable daylight. And it's undeniable that Apple wears multiple hats. They're creating the market and they're also competing in the market. So there's good reasons why things have to change. Again, if you're asking me, I think the Spotify case is much more credible than the Epic case. And so I would expect that we would see reform in the form of Apple no longer competing on the App Store, or Apple being more transparent about the rules or their operating system, rather than doing away with or drastically changing this 30% rule. What is Epic's endgame? Like, what is Epic trying to establish with this? Perfect world for Epic. They win the case. What will happen?
Like if there are good persons, there are good people, they try to improve the ecosystem by bringing content of fairness, whatever. But if there are bad guys, then I think what they want to achieve is
yeah.
Start harmful and maybe gradually start.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. We don't know. There's yeah.
One that I can live with is having the app store to use other, like the Internet Explorer example.
Yeah.
If they manage to get this, even if the 50% doesn't go down, I think that's one.
Right. So their app store would have to be able to exist alongside the iOS app store. And they would have to be able to charge their own revenue share, which then maybe arguably is less than 30%. That's the end game. Are other takes on this? Yeah?
My thing that thinking is for app to try to get the app trust and then try to like.
Right. Yeah. Again, let's not forget that they have a platform themselves, but they also have this engine that is we don't know exactly because it's a private company, but that the income from the engine is substantial. So the CEO has once said that if we didn't have that engine, we would have not been in business anymore because that was such a lifeline to them. And so you're right. Like if they change the situation for themselves and for other app developers, they will also likely increase their income because there will be more developers using the Unreal Engine, right? It's a good point. Yeah, so Sunny, I think you pretty much touched on all of these except for the engine one. But yeah, so there's clear PR benefits, right? As long as this is a thing, there will be a lot of attention to Epic's products, and maybe they're not generating income on the App Store right now, but Fortnite is available on a bajillion other platforms where they could still generate income. They're flag bearers, and so they create a good reputation for themselves, which may reflect to the adoption of the Unreal Engine if other developers believe in Epic's cause. If Apple were to decide to drop their fees, it would directly benefit Epic's software revenue, but it would also create better conditions for developers that are using Unreal. And so we would expect to see an uptake in revenue from Unreal's licensing agreements. And I mean, the true end game, as you guys also already mentioned, is breaking open new markets for the Epic Game Store, right? They want to compete. They want to be able to tap into those billions of consumers that are using smartphones and now can only transact via the App Store. And again, they are pretty confident that they do games better than Apple does games. And so if they are allowed to compete as another store, then I think the expectation is that they will become the main store for games. And all of this, if anything, it weakens the position of these distribution platforms, right? And so that increases their bargaining power. Just the fact that we're talking about it today, there's just an increasing awareness that maybe these platforms have become too powerful. And in the report that came out just this week, they repeatedly mentioned the Epic versus Apple case, and so it's starting to have an effect already. All right, so what happens next? They may go to trial next year. It's been set for May 31st, but until then, I think Apple and other platforms will try to maintain their dominance. Apple and Google will likely keep Fortnite off the platforms, but you said that there was some news about that, so I'll have to look into that. Apple and other big tech companies, they must fend off these mounting antitrust and anti-competitive pressures from policymakers. Apple will keep using momentum to fight its fight. Apple will keep promoting Fortnite, Unreal, and the Epic Game Store. And they might try to settle in the end, right? Which would be largely unsatisfactory to us because we want to see what happens. But it could be that they settle. And a settlement could be, okay, we allow for the Epic Game Store app in the App Store. Do your thing. We will not charge you 30%. That could be part of a deal, which I hope it will get to a court case. But these cases are expensive, and I think they'd rather protect their information than disclose it and actually go to court. All right. Any final thoughts, comments, or questions from your end? Yeah.
Why is the push on App Store as well?
So it's a good point. So there is definitely the same type of conversation going on. Google and Epic have both argued that Google is a substantially different store than Apple is, and so that needs to be a separate court case. So initially there were talks that this would be, let's lump them together, let's have one big court case and try to resolve it for everyone. But everyone seems to think that their chances of winning are better when this is a separate case. But other than that, this could have been about Epic versus Google, but I think for the narrative, it made sense to just focus on it. For my narrative. Yeah. Yeah. Epic, you mean, for Fortnite? I mean, I'm pretty. So this is the thing, right? So they initially Apple wanted to completely close Epic's developer accounts, which meant that they would no longer be able to look into the infrastructure of the iOS, which would not only hurt Fortnite, but it would hurt Unreal, right? It would hurt the engine, and so it was ruled that that was too much of a punishment, and so they have kept their developer license. I'm pretty sure they keep working on it, and that if the app is reinstated, that it's ready to go. Yeah. Maybe there's some furloughs there, but these are so. I think approximately 1/3 of Fortnite's users are on iOS, and so it's a really, really, really important platform for them. Which is not to say that they may also be on other platforms, right? So a user account may play on different platforms, but at least 1/3 of all the users is playing at least sometimes on the iOS, or it was playing sometimes on the iOS.
Apple said that actually quite bad that they don't showing like, oh, if you push Apple like this, then still falls for demand.
Yeah, maybe, but so the thing is, there's only so many companies that can do that, right? You need to be like, no one has the deep pockets like Apple, and pretty much no one has the clout or the brand reputation that Apple has, and so there's only so many players that can actually fight this fight credibly, and that's why it's and that's what makes this interesting, right? Because Epic is one of those players that can, for various reasons that we discussed. So, if anything, I would expect that this App Fairness Coalition will grow, and maybe there could be some sort of class action lawsuit on behalf of that coalition. But I don't expect many individual developers to fight the same type of fight. They might chime in. They might say, we agree with Epic, we support Epic, we think that we need to have fairer App Store practices, but I don't expect many companies to actually engage in this really costly legal fight. All right, it's 12:30. I hope this was fun. I hope you'll have fun in the rest of your studies, and don't forget to sign up for Sunny's enrichment activities.
Thank you so much.